Tonight, the latest developments demand your full attention, and once you hear this, you'll understand why. The entertainment industry is buzzing with news that's sending shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. We're talking about a story that involves one of the most talked about figures in recent years, a massive streaming deal worth hundreds of millions, and a controversy that's revealing uncomfortable truths about fame, authenticity, and what happens when the cameras stop rolling. Before we dive deeper into this developing situation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates on this story. And here's something I want you to think about as we go through this. When does vulnerability cross the line from genuine to calculated? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this question is at the heart of everything we're about to discuss. The news broke quietly, almost too quietly for something this significant. Meghan's partnership with Netflix, a deal that was once valued at around $100 million, has effectively come to an end. But here's what makes this different from your typical celebrity project cancellation. It's not the ending itself that's raising eyebrows. It's the silence surrounding it. No official statements, no dramatic announcements, just a slow fade that industry insiders say speaks volumes about what really happened behind closed doors. Royal biographer Tom Bower has stepped forward with observations that are forcing people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this situation. And I have to tell you, what he's saying isn't what you'd expect. He's not claiming deception or pointing fingers at lies. Instead, he's highlighting something far more subtle and perhaps more damaging, a disconnect between authenticity and presentation, between emotion and timing, between what's real and what feels orchestrated. Let me paint you a picture of what's actually happening here. When the show first launched, there was anticipation, there was curiosity, there was the kind of buzz you'd expect from a project attached to such a high-profile name. But then something strange occurred. The buzz didn't grow. It didn't evolve into conversation or debate or even controversy. It just dissipated. Industry watchers started noticing something unsettling. Not falling viewership numbers, not scathing reviews, but something worse. A complete absence of urgency. Think about how streaming platforms operate. When a show connects, when it resonates, you see it everywhere. Promotional pushes, executive quotes defending the creative vision, features on the homepage, social media campaigns. The platform fights for it because they believe in it. But with this project, none of that happened. There was no second wave of promotion, no attempts to reframe or reintroduce the content. The energy around it cooled almost immediately, as if the enthusiasm had been spent before audiences even arrived. This is what people in the industry call disengagement, and it's far more fatal than cancellation. Cancellation suggests someone made a decision, someone took action. Disengagement means the system simply stopped caring. Meetings moved on, talking points disappeared, and the project became something no one volunteered to explain. When a platform can no longer answer the simple question of who this content is for right now, that's when you know something fundamental has shifted. The show didn't offend anyone. It didn't shock viewers or collapse under public backlash. Instead, it landed at an emotional temperature that simply didn't match the moment it entered. Viewers weren't angry enough to argue about it. They weren't moved enough to defend it. So they did the one thing that algorithms cannot fight against. They scrolled past it. And for a company built entirely on retention metrics and engagement data, that kind of indifference is absolutely fatal. Here's where it gets really interesting. Tom Bower's analysis cuts through all the noise and identifies something that most people felt but couldn't quite articulate. He suggests that the core issue wasn't about truth or dishonesty, it was about timing. Emotional timing, to be specific. The message, according to Bower, arrived out of sync with how people process genuine vulnerability. Let me explain what this means in practical terms. Authenticity isn't measured solely by whether emotions are real or honest. It's also measured by friction, by hesitation, by those unscripted moments that feel genuinely unresolved. When vulnerability arrives too cleanly, when it's paced too evenly, when every emotional beat feels pre-planned, audiences instinctively pull back, not in anger, but in doubt. The stories being told didn't breathe. They arrived fully framed, emotionally resolved, and carefully contextualized. Nothing was left unfinished for audiences to sit with and process on their own. And when everything is explained, when every emotion is presented with perfect polish, nothing lingers in the mind afterward. Bower's framing here quietly reframed the entire public reaction. What people were feeling wasn't betrayal. It was exhaustion. A sense that they were being asked to emotionally participate in something that had already been processed, edited, and positioned for them before they even encountered it. This is the critical distinction that changes everything. When sincerity begins to feel instructional, when vulnerability starts sounding like a prepared thesis instead of a raw confession, the connection between creator and audience weakens fast. And it's not because the story being told is untrue, it's because it no longer feels discovered organically by the viewer. Now let's talk about what wasn't shown, because sometimes absence speaks louder than presence. While the show emphasized warmth, reflection, and emotional clarity, viewers began noticing a quiet disconnect between what was being expressed on screen and what remained completely untouched off camera. We're not talking about minor details here. We're talking about significant personal relationships, family fractures that everyone already knows exist, yet they're never addressed in any meaningful way during these supposedly intimate moments. There were no interruptions of production to deal with these realities, no visible attempts at reconciliation, no pause to acknowledge the fractures that the entire world is already aware of. That omission mattered more than any scripted dialogue ever could. For many people watching, it subtly reshaped the tone of everything that came before. The storytelling began to feel segmented, like emotion was being placed into safe, manageable compartments. Vulnerability was being curated in spaces where it could be controlled, while more uncomfortable realities stayed sealed off from the cameras. This wasn't read by audiences as cruelty, it was read as emotional management, and that distinction changed the entire lens through which people viewed the content. Look, audiences don't expect full transparency from public figures. Everyone understands that boundaries exist, and that some things should remain private. But when a narrative explicitly promises intimacy while simultaneously avoiding its most destabilizing tension, trust erodes quietly but irreversibly. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore, not because viewers are demanding explanations, but because the silence actively reframes the intent behind everything being shown. What once felt reflective started to feel selective, not manipulative exactly, but definitely strategic. And public perception doesn't wait around for nuance or context. It reacts to contrast, to the gap between what's offered and what's deliberately withheld. By the time critics and commentators started articulating these observations, most viewers had already felt it on an instinctive level. Something wasn't missing from the story. Something had been deliberately stepped around. And that realization didn't spark outrage or anger. It sparked reinterpretation. Suddenly, the entire project carried a cooler undertone in people's minds. Less confession, more containment. And while this understanding was settling into public consciousness, another emotional unraveling was happening in a very different setting. When Prince Harry entered the courtroom for his legal proceedings, observers expected technical arguments, carefully prepared statements, timelines, and evidence. Instead, they witnessed something that felt much more like emotional excavation. His responses carried a weight that didn't seem to belong to just this single case. They sounded layered, accumulated, as if years of unresolved memory had been compressed into one setting that finally couldn't deflect or redirect. He wasn't simply reacting to questions being asked, he appeared to be reliving experiences in real time. Each answer felt less like calculated legal strategy and more like emotional release. Not explosive, not uncontrolled, but heavy with the kind of weight that suggests something has been carried far too long without any outlet or relief. The courtroom became a space where carefully maintained restraint visibly cracked. And that visibility mattered tremendously because for the first time in a long while, the emotion being displayed wasn't packaged or processed. It wasn't guided by a narrative arc. It wasn't softened by production techniques. There were no cutaways to manage the mood, no music cues to guide emotional response, no framing language to provide context. Just raw delivery landing unevenly in a space specifically built for precision and facts, not feelings and personal grievances. Even the judge had to intervene at one point, issuing what observers described as a rare warning about the nature of testimony expected in that setting. The message was clear. This wasn't the venue for expressing personal feelings about behavior being discussed. It was a place for answering specific questions with specific information. That intervention itself became part of the story because it highlighted just how much the situation had deviated from standard legal proceedings. Coverage of these courtroom moments began to shift as a result. Commentary stopped focusing primarily on potential legal outcomes and started circling something else entirely. The sense that this wasn't really about winning a case or generating a headline. It felt like unresolved history demanding acknowledgement in the only environment left that couldn't mute it or edit it or reframe it for easier consumption. That made the moment deeply unsettling for observers, not because anything inappropriate was happening, but because it felt so profoundly overdue. And in stark contrast to the measured, carefully controlled storytelling happening in other venues, this courtroom scene felt genuinely unfiltered in a way audiences hadn't witnessed before. Which raised a quiet but deeply uncomfortable question. If this is what uncontained emotion actually looks like, what exactly had everything else been? By this point in the timeline, the issue facing public perception wasn't about exposure or visibility, it was about pattern recognition. Across memoirs, interviews, documentaries, and long-form projects, a rhythm had formed that audiences could sense, even if they couldn't precisely articulate what they were noticing. Deeply personal moments being released at precise intervals, emotional disclosures framed with extreme care, then followed by extended silence until the next scheduled reveal. Nothing felt accidental anymore. And that precision itself became the fundamental problem. Because here's the thing about vulnerability in the public eye. People don't reject it because it's too much or too raw. They pull away when it starts to feel scheduled, when it arrives on a predictable timeline with professional polish instead of genuine hesitation. When every confession feels pre-approved, when every emotional moment has been contextualized and made ready for consumption, audiences don't feel overwhelmed by the content. They feel managed by the presentation. And that shift is subtle but absolutely decisive in terms of public connection. Because once audiences sense they're being guided toward a specific emotional response rather than being trusted to form their own, empathy shuts down quietly, not in protest or rebellion, but in self-preservation. The stories being shared still carried legitimate weight and addressed real experiences, but they no longer surprised anyone. Each new release felt less like discovery and more like continuation, just another chapter placed exactly where it was expected to land in an ongoing narrative. And expectation is dangerous when it comes to vulnerability. When vulnerable moments become predictable, they lose friction. Without friction, there's no genuine tension for audiences to engage with. Without tension, there's nothing for people to hold on to emotionally. This is the precise point where the narrative began to slide from active resistance into passive maintenance, from defiance against criticism into simple upkeep of a public position. What once felt like breaking free from constraints started to resemble sustaining a carefully managed image. Not dishonest, but engineered. And engineering, by its very nature, drains intimacy at an accelerating pace. Let me tell you what happened next, because this is where things get really revealing about how the entertainment industry actually works. Decline at this level doesn't announce itself with dramatic rejection or public statements. It arrives as quiet administration, as bureaucratic reshuffling, no definitive rejection, no explosive fallout, just a slow rearranging of institutional priorities that happens behind closed doors. Projects stop being fast-tracked for development. Responses to pitches take longer to arrive. Conversations lose their previous momentum and urgency. And critically, none of this happens because anyone is actively angry or trying to punish someone. It happens because attention and resources have simply shifted elsewhere toward opportunities that feel more aligned with current audience interests and platform needs. In systems entirely built on relevance and cultural timing, speed of response is belief. When executives move quickly, when decisions happen fast, that signals institutional faith in a project or partnership. And in this case, that belief had clearly moved on to other priorities. This is the phase that most outside observers completely miss. From the external perspective, everything still looks intact. Contracts technically exist, relationships remain professionally polite, public statements stay diplomatic. But inside the actual machine of the industry, urgency has vanished entirely. The work is no longer being actively defended in meetings. It's no longer framed as essential to the platform's strategy or identity. It simply becomes optional. And in this business, optional is absolutely fatal to long-term prospects. What makes this stage particularly chilling is its near-total invisibility to the public. There's no headline for delayed email replies, no trade publication article about postponed development decisions, no announcement when institutional enthusiasm quietly evaporates. It all happens in the gaps, behind scheduling conflicts, through vague assurances about revisiting ideas later, in phrases like timing's complicated or let's circle back on this. Those phrases don't sound like endings when you hear them, but they are endings. They're how institutions communicate that something is over without ever having to explicitly say so. This is exactly what Tom Bauer was pointing toward without dramatizing it for effect. Not collapse, not exile, but simple detachment. A system no longer organizing itself around someone's presence or prioritizing their projects. By the time that realization fully hits, the shift is already completely finished, because institutions at this level don't sever ties impulsively or emotionally. They loosen connections gradually until those connections fall away entirely on their own, without anyone having to make a difficult decision or deliver bad news directly. And here's the most damaging part of this entire dynamic. There's nothing concrete to fight against. No villain to rally against, no specific decision to appeal, no single moment where you can generate public sympathy or reverse momentum. Just the slow, creeping awareness that doors aren't slamming shut. They're simply no longer being opened in the first place. So why does this story refuse to disappear from public consciousness? Why do people keep following developments even as the actual content fades from relevance? It's not because audiences are furious or because fierce loyalty battles are being fought. It's because something deeply familiar is happening in real time, something that resonates with broader experiences people recognize from their own lives and observations. Audiences aren't watching out of loyalty to any particular side anymore. They're not hate watching either. They're watching to understand what happens when a narrative loses its ability to set the terms of its own reception, when creators can no longer control how their story is interpreted or discussed, when the audience stops waiting to be guided, persuaded, or emotionally instructed about how they should feel. What's driving continued attention now isn't outrage or scandal, it's recognition. Viewers see a broader pattern playing out that they've felt elsewhere in media and culture. The exhaustion of being told exactly how to interpret emotion, the quiet resistance to narratives that arrive pre-framed and emotionally concluded before audiences even encounter them. This particular story taps into that cultural fatigue perfectly, not as spectacle or entertainment, but as case study. Every new development isn't being consumed primarily for drama. It's being examined for what it signals about larger questions. What does this reveal about how attention actually works? About how credibility is built and lost? About how quickly influence can thin once it stops feeling organic and starts feeling manufactured? That's why engagement with the story persists even as genuine passion fades. People aren't invested in rooting for specific outcomes anymore. They're invested in observing the process itself. They're watching how relevance dissolves without obvious conflict, how control slips away without direct confrontation. It's a uniquely modern form of unraveling. No traditional villain arc, no redemption arc, just drift. And drift is uniquely unsettling to witness because it offers no clear resolution, no final moment where the story ends cleanly and everyone can move on. It simply continues, getting lighter with each iteration, carrying less cultural weight with every new appearance or statement. That's what keeps people clicking and following along. Not anticipation of chaos or dramatic revelation, but genuine curiosity about erosion. About what remains when emotional authority fades and audiences quietly step back from active participation. In that space between active engagement and complete dismissal, something irreversible happens to a public narrative. The story doesn't end in any traditional sense. It simply stops leading the conversation. And once that fundamental shift occurs, the next chapter of the story belongs entirely to the observers and commentators, not to the subjects themselves. So what's the real lesson here that applies beyond this specific situation? In my view, it comes down to this. Authenticity cannot be forced or manufactured, no matter how skilled the attempt. No matter how vulnerable someone appears on camera, if the audience senses that vulnerability is calculated or strategically deployed, that genuine connection will never properly form. And this isn't just one person's story or one couple's experience. This is the story of every creator, every influencer, every public figure who has attempted to turn vulnerability into content, who has tried to commodify personal pain for professional gain. We're living in an age where emotional exposure has been completely commodified, and audiences are rapidly getting better at spotting the crucial difference between authentic sharing and strategic selling. Think about your own media consumption. How many times have you watched something that felt too polished to be genuinely spontaneous? How often have you seen carefully curated sadness that's technically real but also obviously controlled for maximum impact? That feeling you get in those moments, that's what we're talking about here. That's the disconnect that ultimately breaks the bond between creator and audience. By the time everything settles in this situation, there won't be a dramatic collapse to point to as a defining moment. No final statement that closes the chapter, no explosive ending that provides catharsis or closure. Just a quiet shift in attention that, by the time you notice it, already feels essentially complete. What this story reveals isn't failure in any traditional sense. It's something far more modern and perhaps more significant. Influence doesn't disappear when people actively turn against you. It fades when they stop needing you to explain yourself, when audiences no longer wait for your context, your meaning, your emotional guidance on how to interpret events. That's the real turning point in any public narrative. Because once a story loses its ability to shape how it's received and discussed, it becomes purely reactive. Each new appearance carries less gravity than the last. Each response to criticism lands softer. Eventually, even genuinely major moments struggle to command the focus and attention they once would have automatically received. The truth is, we're all watching a masterclass in how modern influence actually works, and how quickly it can evaporate when the foundation isn't solid. This isn't about taking sides or passing judgment. It's about understanding the mechanics of attention in an age where authenticity is the ultimate currency, and audiences have become incredibly sophisticated at detecting when that currency isn't genuine. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. Do you think audiences have become too cynical, or are we simply getting better at recognizing manufactured emotion? Is there a way back from this kind of public perception shift, or once that trust is broken, is it permanent? Share your thoughts in the comments because this conversation is far from over. And if you found this analysis valuable, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We'll continue following this story as it develops and examining what it tells us about fame, authenticity, and influence in the modern media landscape. The implications of what we're witnessing extend far beyond any single individual or situation. Hit that like button if this gave you a new perspective, and I'll see you in the next one where we continue unpacking the stories that shape our cultural conversation.